Chapter 1. The Curriculum. He was 8 years old, and he corrected her math. Freya Dunmore stood in a sun-drenched schoolroom at the top of Silverwood Keep, watching her meticulously color-coded curriculum disintegrate in real time. The binder had taken 2 weeks. It had thematic units, sensory integration activities, a section titled Fun with Geometry that she had illustrated herself with colored pencils at midnight in a moment of professional optimism she now regarded as a form of temporary insanity. Prince Leonardo Alaric Callum Sterling. Leo, 8, heir to the mountain throne, had glanced at the binder, turned to the page on geometric fundamentals, and said, with the serene disinterest of someone declining a canapé, "We could spend an hour identifying circles and squares, or we could discuss the practical applications of platonic solids in crystalline structures." He did not look up from the model dodecahedron he was building out of magnetic sticks. "Your choice." She stared at him. He had dark honey hair and eyes the color of old gold, and he was examining her the way a surgeon examines an X-ray, not unkindly, but with a clinical interest in what was structurally wrong. "That went well," Patience observed. "You established dominance immediately. He only corrected you twice. The morning is young." Freya's wolf had named herself Patience in what had started as a joke and was becoming, with each passing year, a more pointed piece of irony. She was sardonic in the way a lighthouse was bright, not because she tried, but because it was the only setting she had. "You're 8, Freya said. "My chronological age is an irrelevant data point," Leo replied, snapping 2 magnetic rods together with the confidence of a tenured professor. "Did you know the dual of a dodecahedron is the icosahedron? It's much more elegant." Freya looked at her binder. She looked at the boy. She looked at the binder again. Then she closed it with the quiet, dignified finality of someone closing a casket. She had prepared for this. She had prepared for everything. Her suitcase contained backup lesson plans for 3 different age ranges, a laminated schedule, and a color wheel of sticker rewards. She had arrived at Silverwood Keep with the organizational firepower of a woman who believed, with the fervor of the deeply afraid, that if she planned hard enough, nothing could go wrong. Everything had gone wrong in 11 minutes. "Excellent," Patience said. "The sticker rewards were a particularly inspired touch. He'll treasure them. Perhaps he can use them to label his thesis chapters." The door opened. She turned. The man in the doorway was tall, built with the solid strength of someone who had earned his body through use rather than vanity, and he had faint shadows under his eyes. Eyes the exact same shade of old gold as his son's. Alpha King Duncan Sterling looked tired, gentle, and like a man who had been handsome once and had stopped noticing. Freya noticed. "Noted," Patience said. "Miss Dunmore," he said, his voice a low baritone that was probably just how he talked, and was not, she told herself firmly, relevant to anything. "Welcome. I trust Leo is behaving himself?" "He's been a perfect gentleman, Your Majesty," Freya said. Duncan gave his son a look of fond, weary love. "He's quiet. Too quiet since his mother passed." The shadows under his eyes deepened for a moment. "I'm hoping you can bring him out of his shell." Leo, not looking up from his dodecahedron, spoke into the silence. "Your sample equation on the welcome board has an error. 6 times 9 is 54. You wrote 56. Freya went still. She stared at the board. In her nervousness, in her desperate need to have everything perfect, she had transposed 2 numbers on a simple multiplication problem meant to be decorative. A hot flush crept up her neck. She had transposed 2 numbers on a decorative equation, in front of the king, on her first day, before unpacking. A minor setback, Patience said, with the tone of someone describing a house fire as a heating malfunction. "The important thing is that you're projecting confidence. He definitely can't tell you're dying inside." "You're doing beautifully." Duncan chuckled, a low, warm sound. "Don't mind him. He's just showing off." He paused and then added, almost to himself, "You didn't flinch, though. Most people flinch." Freya looked at him. It was such a small observation. Quiet, specific, real. Not a compliment, just a thing he'd noticed. The kind of thing only someone who was paying attention would say. But Leo was watching her, not with mockery, with evaluation. He made a small, precise tick mark on a piece of paper next to his schematic. Freya Dunmore had the distinct, chilling feeling she had just passed some kind of test she hadn't signed up for. She should have run. She could see the entire trajectory. She was a woman who cataloged disasters the way other people cataloged bird sightings, not because she enjoyed them, but because she had a professional interest in the specific angle of her own destruction. She could see herself staying, falling in love with the genius child and the sad, handsome king, making a terrible, life-altering decision in a castle with sentient staircases and an 8-year-old who was smarter than everyone in the building. She saw all of this, clearly, with perfect, devastating foresight. And she stayed anyway. Chapter 2. The King's Frequency. SFX, stone corridor, muffled voices behind a heavy door. Duncan Sterling had been king for 6 years and a father for 8, and he was reasonably sure he was failing at both. The reasonable sureness was new. For the first 3 years after Marin's death, it had been an absolute certainty, a cold, settled fact that sat in his chest like a stone. He had watched his son retreat into a world of numbers and schematics and combustion engines, a world that Duncan could see but not enter, and he had stood on the other side of the glass and tried to look like a man who knew what he was doing. He did not know what he was doing. He had, over 6 years, developed an impressive simulation of knowing. A managed face, a measured voice, a set of diplomatic reflexes so well practiced they passed for competence at every distance except close range. Up close, anyone paying attention would notice that the Alpha King of Silverwood Keep made most of his decisions in the first 3 seconds, and spent the remaining 40 minutes of each council session performing the appearance of deliberation. "She's teaching him," Riot said quietly. "Listen, he's laughing." Duncan paused outside the schoolroom door. Through the heavy oak, he could hear Leo's voice. Not the careful, clipped tone he used in council, not the polite blankness he wore around the pack, but something lighter. A child's voice, arguing about crystalline structures with genuine delight. It had been 3 weeks. 3 weeks of Freya Dunmore in his castle, and his son was laughing. Not the polite, performative laugh Leo deployed at state dinners, a real one, the kind that came with crumbs of whatever she'd smuggled into the schoolroom, and an argument about the structural integrity of the castle's plumbing that somehow involved the fall of Constantinople. Riot was earnest in a way that Duncan found occasionally devastating. His wolf did not strategize, did not weigh options. Riot simply felt things, with a directness that made Duncan's carefully managed composure look like the performance it was. "The pup is happy," Riot said. Simple, warm, as if this were all that mattered in the world, and as if Duncan were being foolish for pretending it wasn't. Duncan leaned against the wall and listened. Through the door, he could hear Freya explaining why the Roman aqueduct system was, in her professional opinion, overhyped, and Leo was disagreeing loudly, and she was letting him disagree, and the argument was building towards something that sounded, improbably, like joy. She was funny. That was the thing Duncan hadn't expected and couldn't stop noticing. Not joke funny, not performing humor, but the kind of funny that came from a person who saw the absurdity of her own situation and narrated it with deadpan precision. Yesterday she had described the moving staircases as architecturally hostile, and the castle library as a structural death trap curated by a woman who actively wants people to fall. She hadn't been wrong about either. He was not going to think about the new tutor. He was going to think about the council meeting in an hour, where Lord Alastair Graves would be waiting with his reasonable concerns and his pointed questions and his absolute, unwavering conviction that Duncan Sterling was an unfit king. Alastair was not a villain. That was what made him exhausting. They had grown up together, run through these halls as boys, trained together in the first campaigns of Duncan's father's reign. Alistair had been his closest friend, and Alistair genuinely believed, with the passionate certainty of a man who loved the kingdom in his own way, that Duncan was letting it rot. "Your perimeter guard is a liability," Alistair had said at the last council session, his voice carrying the calm authority of a man stating obvious facts. "2 of your sentries were taking photographs of the sunset yesterday, during a live watch rotation. I have served 3 Alpha Kings, Duncan. None of them would have tolerated this." The room had gone quiet, not because Alistair was wrong, because he was right. The guard rotation had been sloppy. Duncan knew it. He also knew that the 2 sentries in question were 19 and 21, barely out of their first shifts, and that Serena had already reduced them to stammering apologies. But none of that made Alistair's point less valid. The worst part was that Alistair delivered his critiques the way a doctor delivers a diagnosis. Not with relish, but with the grim conviction that honesty was a form of kindness. He genuinely believed he was helping. He genuinely believed that Duncan's grief had made him soft, that the kingdom was drifting, and that someone had to say it out loud before the drift became a disaster. And Duncan, who had spent 6 years performing certainty while feeling none of it, could not always tell whether Alistair was wrong. "Your Majesty," Serena had muttered afterward, her exasperation barely contained. "If Lord Graves could direct even half the energy he spends critiquing our guard rotation toward actually helping with the perimeter schedule, we'd have the most secure border in the Northern Territories." Duncan had smiled thinly. "He thinks I'm failing. He thinks you're distracted." She was right about that too. He was distracted. He had a son who was smarter than his entire council combined, a kingdom that ran on the export of bioluminescent moss, and a new tutor who had described his castle as architecturally hostile and made it the funniest thing he'd heard in months. "The pup is laughing," Riot said again, gently. "When was the last time?" Duncan leaned against the stone wall outside the schoolroom and closed his eyes. He could hear Freya's voice through the door, steady, warm, with an undercurrent of dry pragmatism that reminded him of the way Serena talked, except softer. She was explaining something about the Peloponnesian War, and Leo was asking follow-up questions about supply chain logistics, and she was keeping up. No one kept up with Leo. That was the problem. That was what Alistair didn't understand, what the council didn't understand, what Duncan himself had failed to solve for 4 years. Leo didn't need a simpler world. He needed someone who could meet him where he actually was. "She meets him," Riot said. "She sees him." Duncan opened his eyes. His managed face, the one he wore for councils and ceremonies and diplomatic dinners, settled back into place. He would not think about the tutor. He had a kingdom to hold together and a friend to disappoint. Chapter 3. The List. The moving stairs happened on a Thursday. Freya had been warned about Tuesdays. No one had mentioned Thursdays. She was 20 feet in the air on a library platform that now faced a solid wall of books, holding a volume on pack dynamics that she would have traded for a ladder, when a low voice drifted up from below. "It does that on Thursdays, too." She looked down. Duncan Sterling was standing at the base of the grand staircase, a book in one hand, a small smile on his face. Moonlight from the high windows caught in his dark honey hair, and his eyes were warm gold in the dim light. "The aqueduct again?" she asked, aiming for casual and landing somewhere near composed woman trapped by sentient architecture. "And the lunar cycle." The smile widened by a fraction. "It's a terribly inefficient design." He was quoting Leo. The shared joke hung between them, intimate and unexpected. It was the kind of joke that required context, weeks of context, of shared meals where Leo explained the keep's hydraulic systems over breakfast, of afternoons where Duncan stopped by the schoolroom and stayed longer than a king should, of the slow accumulation of small, unremarkable moments that were, in aggregate, building something neither of them had named. Their days had developed a rhythm. Mornings were Leo's, quantum mechanics on Mondays, ancient Sumerian politics on Tuesdays, ethics of emerging technologies on Wednesdays, and a rotating slot on Thursdays and Fridays that Leo filled with whatever had kept him up the night before. She was his student as much as his teacher, and for the first time since her own wolf had awakened late, 3 years after her peers, a humiliation she had never quite metabolized. She didn't feel like she was performing competence. She felt competent. The distinction was everything. And then Duncan would arrive, every afternoon exactly. His presence a warm, disruptive gravity well in her carefully ordered classroom. He would ask about Leo's progress, and she would tell him, and they would talk for 10 minutes about his son, with the easy shorthand of two people who cared about the same person in different ways. And each time the 10 minutes got a little longer, and each time the space between them got a little smaller. He directed her to a service ladder hidden behind a tapestry, and a few minutes later she was back on solid ground, her face warm and her dignity mostly intact. Graceful descent, Patience observed. Very athletic. The part where you nearly fell off the ladder was particularly compelling. I'd score it an 8. Thank you, Freya said to Duncan. She meant for the ladder. She also meant for quoting his son in the dark, which had been the most disarming thing anyone had done to her in years. Don't mention it. Elsbeth considers the stairs a feature, not a bug. Thins the herd, she says. They stood in companionable silence. This was, she was learning, Duncan's natural mode. Not the public performance, not the measured diplomacy, but this. Quiet. Present. A man who was most himself when he wasn't speaking, whose real warmth lived in the spaces between words. The library at night was vast and still, and he was a steady presence beside her. She was acutely aware of the space between them. 18 inches. 17. He wasn't moving closer. He also wasn't moving away. She had noticed other things over the weeks. The way he crouched to Leo's eye level every time he spoke to him, even in public, even in front of the council. The way he asked Leo genuine questions, not the indulgent questions adults ask children, but the kind that assumed the answer would be worth hearing. The way he remembered what she told him about Leo's progress and followed up the next day, not as a king reviewing a report, but as a father who had been thinking about it. These were not the observations of a tutor. She was aware of this. She had catalogued the awareness and filed it under professional hazard, developing, severe. You filed it, Patience observed. That's very healthy. I'm sure the filing will protect you. Freya. He said her first name the way he said everything. Low, measured, controlled. But the fact that he'd used it at all was a crack in the managed surface. Thank you for what you're doing with Leo. He's an incredible child, she said. I know, and it terrifies me. The admission was quiet, raw. The king was gone, only the father remained. His mother understood him. They had their own language. Since she passed, I feel like I'm watching him through thick glass. I see him, but I can't reach him. The pain in his voice did something to her chest. She looked at this man, this king who had unified the mountain packs and held a kingdom together on moss revenue and stubbornness, and saw a father who was afraid he was losing his son. He's not lonely, she said, and her voice was fierce with a conviction she hadn't planned. He's just operating on a different frequency. You haven't failed him, Duncan. You just got him a translator. Something shifted in his face. Not a dramatic change. Nothing about Duncan Sterling was dramatic. The shadows under his eyes lightened by a degree. His shoulders dropped half an inch, and his gaze held hers for 3 seconds longer than professional. How did you learn to do that? He asked. Keep up with him. No one else has managed it. Stubbornness mostly. She leaned against the railing, and their shoulders were almost touching. When I was 12, I had a teacher who told me I wasn't bright enough for the advanced track. So I read every textbook for the advanced track, cover to cover, twice. I didn't get in, but I knew the material better than anyone who did. She paused. Leo reminds me of that. He doesn't need someone smarter than him. He needs someone who won't stop trying to understand him. Duncan was quiet for a moment. That's the most you've ever told me about yourself. She blinked. He was right. 6 weeks and she'd kept every conversation about Leo, about the curriculum, about the keep's structural nightmares. Professional distance, maintained with the same obsessive thoroughness she applied to everything. And now, in a moonlit library at midnight, she had dropped it without meaning to.
Well, Patience said, that was careless. You showed him a real thing. This is going to be a problem. It was already a problem, because the way he was looking at her, just him, the man, seeing her, was the most dangerous thing that had happened in this castle so far. She saw something shift in him then, a gold flicker behind his irises, there and gone, a stillness in his posture that was too absolute to be human. His head tilted a fraction toward her, not a conscious movement. Interesting, Patience said, her tone that of someone watching a nature documentary with sardonic detachment. The large predator appears to be experiencing feelings. You should probably do something about the fact that your own heart rate just doubled. Just a thought. The space between them shrank to 12 inches. His hand rose, tracing the air near her cheek without touching. She leaned toward the phantom contact, her eyes half closing. And then a polite voice echoed from the end of the hall.
Father? Miss Dunmore? Cook says if you're not going to eat the leftover roast, she's giving it to the dogs. She says the optimal palatability window closes in approximately 7 minutes. They sprang apart. Leo stood in the corridor in his pajamas, holding a half-eaten apple, his golden eyes missing nothing. Duncan cleared his throat. Right, the roast. Wouldn't want it going to the dogs. As they walked back, Freya could see the trajectory again. The complete, precisely narrated disaster of falling in love with a man whose son was running a vetting process on her. Because she had found the list. She'd discovered it 3 days earlier, tucked between the pages of Leo's notebook during a lesson on supply chain logistics. Written in the careful, precise handwriting of an 8-year-old who was still mastering cursive, but the intent was clinical. Criteria for someone who stays, version 3.2, revised. 1. Must not shout. Confirmed, week 1. 2. Must demonstrate cognitive flexibility. Confirmed. Adapted curriculum within 11 minutes of initial plan failure. Impressive recovery time. 3. Must not be afraid of the moving staircases. Confirmed. Subject cursed mildly on day 3, but continued ascending. Acceptable threshold. 4. Must be capable of admitting when wrong. Confirmed. Corrected the 6x9 error without defensiveness. Promising. 5. Must be smarter than the guards. Confirmed. Significantly. Low bar. 6. Must make father laugh at least once. Pending. Father does not laugh easily. Monitoring. 7. Wolf assessment. Pending. Note: her wolf appears to have a personality. This is promising. Most adults' wolves are boring. 8. Must not sigh dramatically when father enters the room. Confirmed. Unlike previous candidate. See file closed. 9. Must survive the library on a Thursday. Test scheduled. It was not a child's game. It was a peer-reviewed experiment with version control. A methodical, criteria-based evaluation protocol for a new mother, designed and maintained by a boy who had channeled all of his extraordinary intelligence into a single, desperate project. Finding someone who would stay. She had looked at that list, at the careful revisions and the little stars next to confirmed items, and felt 2 things simultaneously. The first was a tenderness so fierce it frightened her. The second was a quiet, creeping dread. Leo wanted someone who would stay. And Freya Dunmore
who had catalogued every exit route in this castle before she'd finished her first week, was not a person who stayed.
"Don't cry in front of the child," Patience said. Then, more gently than Freya had ever heard from her, "He's trying to fix it, the only way he knows how. He's trying to fix the thing that broke." Chapter 4. Tariff Season. Duncan's managed mode had a specific sound. It was the voice he used in council, measured, deliberate, each word chosen for minimum exposure and maximum control. It was the voice of a man who had learned, through years of grief and governance, that showing the real thing underneath was a luxury he could not afford. The real mode had a different sound entirely. It was rare. It was brief. And when it appeared, it tended to land like a precision strike. One exact sentence that cut through everything. At the state dinner, both modes collided spectacularly. The great hall was filled with the low hum of diplomacy. A delegation from the Greymane territories had arrived to renegotiate the moss tariff, the kingdom's primary export, a bioluminescent fungus that grew in the deep caverns and was worth, pound for pound, more than most luxury goods. Lord Gromley, the delegation head, was halfway through a presentation on projected mineral output that Duncan was following with the focused patience of a man who had been trained to endure.
"She's here," Riot said quietly. "Third table. The blue dress. She wore it because it makes her eyes look like the sky after rain. I don't think she knows she did that."
Duncan kept his eyes on Gromley. "And with a projected 12% increase in our mineral output, we believe a reduction in your moss tariff to 7.4% is more than equitable. Your projection is flawed." The voice was small, clear, and came from approximately 3 feet off the ground. The entire hall went silent. Leo was seated beside Duncan, in a miniature formal tunic, a coloring book and crayons his only concession to his age. He was not looking up from his drawing. "You've failed to account for the seasonal depreciation of your extraction equipment and the projected labor cost increase following the next equinox," Leo continued, coloring in what appeared to be a schematic of the hall's ventilation system. "Your actual output increase will be closer to 9.2%. A 7.4% tariff would be a net loss for our kingdom. Based on my calculations, 8.5% is the minimal equitable rate." He paused. Miss Dunmore taught me about economic modeling. Every eye in the hall swiveled to Freya. Duncan watched her face cycle through several emotions in rapid succession: horror, mortification, a brief flash of pride she couldn't suppress, and then a kind of resigned acceptance that suggested she had already calculated the exact trajectory of this disaster and was simply watching it arrive. Lord Gromley's face went the color of an overripe plum. The delegation murmured. Serena, seated near the far wall, closed her eyes with the expression of someone who had seen the meteor coming and could do nothing but admire its trajectory. Alistair, seated at Duncan's right, was the only person in the hall who did not look shocked. He looked thoughtful. His gaze moved from Leo to Freya and then to Duncan, reading the geometry of it, the boy, the tutor, the king, with the focused attention of a man who understood leverage. Duncan's managed face held. It held through the silence. It held through Lord Gromley's sputtering recovery. It held through the diplomatic smoothing that followed, the careful redirections and the tactful subject changes. It held right up until Serena leaned over and whispered, "For the record, Your Majesty, his number was right. I checked." Something twitched at the corner of Duncan's mouth. He suppressed it. It twitched again. "She taught him that," Riot said, warm with wonder. "She taught our pup to see the numbers under the numbers. She's magnificent." Duncan excused himself to the corridor. Leo dispatched to bed with Serena and found Freya already there, leaning against the wall with the expression of someone who had calculated the exact angle of impact, noted it in her mental ledger, and was now waiting for the crater to form. He can't just publicly dismantle a foreign delegate's entire economic proposal, Duncan said. He was trying to sound stern. His mouth was doing something unhelpful. Was he wrong? Freya asked, deadpan, not a trace of apology in it. Duncan's managed mode collapsed. The laugh came from somewhere deep, a real, full sound that echoed off the stone walls, and it undid him. He hadn't laughed like that he couldn't remember. The sound surprised him. It surprised Riot, who went very quiet and very still with the force of recognition. "Oh," his wolf said softly. "That's what that sounds like."
I forgot. Something happened in his body that was not under his control. A warmth spread through his shoulders, his spine. The tips of his ears sharpened, just slightly, pushing through his hair, and at the base of his spine, a phantom weight twitched, once, twice, 3 times, before he clamped down on it with every ounce of royal discipline he possessed. It did not work. The phantom tail was delighted. The phantom tail had opinions about this woman that transcended the capacity of the Alpha King's composure to contain. It was wagging with the abandon of a wolf who had just discovered that joy was a physical event. He froze, braced himself against the wall. His entire body was vibrating at a frequency that was, he suspected, visible from space. "Just a moment," he managed, his voice strained. "Old battle wound. Back spasm." Freya was watching him with the precise, cataloging attention of a woman who had just identified exactly what was happening and was electing not to mention it. Her gaze dropped to the base of his spine, where the phantom tail was making his entire body vibrate, and then returned to his face with an expression of studied neutrality. "Of course," she said, "a spasm." The gold in his eyes was not subtle, not this time. Not with the laugh still echoing in him, and the wolf so close to the surface that his own body was betraying him. She was close. Close enough that he could see the exact shade of her eyes in the dim corridor light, and the small crease between her brows that appeared when she was deciding whether to say something honest. "Freya," he breathed, and for the second time a small, polite prince intervened via messenger. "Your Majesty?" Serena appeared at the end of the corridor, her exasperation at its usual operational maximum. "Lord Gromley is crying in the west parlor. I need you to manage the diplomatic fallout. I would do it myself, but he says my tone is, and I quote, emotionally hostile." Duncan dropped his head against the stone wall. Later, walking the corridors alone, Alistair found him. "Your son humiliated a foreign delegate in your own great hall tonight," Alistair said. His voice was not cruel. It was tired, and that was worse. A child, 8 years old, correcting a senior diplomat on trade mathematics in front of the entire delegation. Do you understand what that looks like? What it says about your household? Duncan said nothing. His managed face was locked. "I'm not your enemy, Duncan. I've never been your enemy. But you are distracted. You have been since Marin died, and I understand it, I do. But understanding it doesn't make it less dangerous. The kingdom needs a king who is present, fully present." Alistair paused. Not a man who is falling apart in hallways because his wolf can't hold it together. Duncan looked at him. The managed mode held, but underneath, Riot was very quiet, in a way that meant, he saw. He saw us. And he's not wrong about the rest. "Your concerns are noted, Alistair," Duncan said, measured, controlled, each word a small, careful wall. He walked away before his real voice could say the thing it wanted to say, which was, "I know." He found Freya on the east terrace. She was sitting on the stone railing with her legs dangling over the edge, which was exactly the kind of thing a woman who catalogued disasters should not do, and she was looking at the stars with the expression of someone who had stopped cataloguing for the night. "Gromley?" she asked without turning. Diplomatically stabilized. Serena fed him brandy and apologized for Leo in terms that were, technically, an apology. Technically. The tone may have been hostile. She laughed.
It was a real laugh, quiet, easy, the kind you only make when you've given up trying to be professional and are just being a person. Duncan sat on the railing beside her, not touching, but close enough that the space between them felt like a choice. They sat in silence for a while. The mountains were black against a sky full of cold, bright stars, and the air smelled like pine and snow and the faintly metallic tang of the moss farms far below. "Can I ask you something?" Freya said. "You're going to anyway." She glanced at him, and the corner of her mouth twitched. "When you come to the schoolroom every afternoon, is that for Leo, or is that for your wolf?" It was the most direct thing she had ever said to him. Duncan looked at the stars. "At first," he said, "it was for Leo. I wanted to make sure he wasn't scaring you off. The last 3 tutors left within a week." He paused. "Then it was because you were teaching him about the Peloponnesian War, using his own plumbing schematics as a comparative model, and I wanted to know how it ended." "And now?" The word sat in the air between them. And now. The question underneath the question. Was he here because of Leo, or because of her? He looked at her. Just looked. "Now I come because you told me the stairs move on Thursdays too, and you sounded annoyed about it, and it was the funniest thing I'd heard in 4 years. Something in her chest did a slow, quiet turn. The specific, tired, careful man who noticed that she didn't flinch, who remembered that she liked the library at midnight, who had just said, in his understated way, that he came to see her because she was funny. "I have nothing sardonic to say about this," Patience said, "and I resent it." They sat on the railing until the cold drove them in, and they walked back through the quiet corridors of a castle that was, for once, not moving. Chapter 5. The Collapse. The library's oldest wing had been a structural compromise since before Duncan's father was born. 3 generations of Royal Engineers had written reports about the load-bearing inadequacy of the pre-unification manuscript section, the stressed timber in the upper galleries, and the catastrophic interaction between the building's aqueduct-linked counterweight system and the natural settling of the mountain stone. Every report recommended the same thing, a full structural overhaul. Every king had done the same thing, filed the report and allocated the funds elsewhere. On a stormy Thursday afternoon, the mountain and the library ran out of patience with each other. Freya was searching for a diagram in a heavy tome when the sound came. Not an explosion, a groan. Deep, structural, the sound of something that had been holding on for a century, finally letting go. Then a crash that shook the floor under her feet, and a plume of dust erupted from the old wing. Leo was gone. He had been right there, 3 minutes ago, examining the support beam configuration of the upper gallery because he found it, in his words, an interesting failure mode. "Leo?" she called, then louder, "Leo!" Silence. Dust. The moan of stressed wood. She ran. Patience went silent. The wolf's absence was a void, not a retreat, an absence. As if the sardonic, steady voice that had been reframing Freya's disasters as strategic victories since she was 14 had simply ceased to exist. The silence was so absolute that Freya could hear her own pulse, and it was the loneliest sound in the world. She reached the old wing. A massive section of ceiling and a towering bookshelf had collapsed, burying the reading alcove in timber and stone. Dust choked the air. Guards arrived, Serena arrived, and then Duncan was there, his face white, his gold eyes wild, the king gone, and only the father remaining. His gaze found hers across the devastation, and in it she saw not blame, but a shared, shattering terror that was worse than any accusation. The search began, organized, methodical, agonizingly slow. The entrance to the void was blocked by a massive oak beam wedged at a precarious angle. Any attempt to shift it risked bringing the rest of the unstable ceiling down. Then, a voice. Small, clear.
"Father? Miss Dunmore?" Every person in the room froze.
"I'm in a cantilevered void," Leo called. "The main support beam created a triangular pocket. It's structurally sound, for now. Miss Dunmore taught me about load-bearing walls." Freya's knees nearly buckled. He was alive, and he had used something she taught him. A spark of pride in the darkness, tiny, fierce, and immediate. "We can't shift the main beam, Your Majesty," Serena said, her voice tight. "Too unstable." Duncan's eyes were blazing. He was seconds from shifting. She could see it in the line of his shoulders, the way the gold was eating the brown of his irises. Freya was already moving. She knew this building. Leo had spent weeks teaching her its structural quirks. The counterweight system linked to the main aqueduct, the pressure differentials on the Thursday flush cycle, the service passages that ran between the walls like the veins of a living creature. She had cataloged every piece of it, because that was what she did. She prepared. She planned. She filed information in systems that other people called obsessive, and she called survival. "There's a service passage," she said, her voice hard and clear. "Behind the tapestry on the south wall. Leo showed me. It runs parallel to the upper gallery. If the collapse followed the fault line he identified last week, the passage should still be intact past the third junction." She did not wait for permission. She did not check with the guards. She did not look at Duncan. Because if she looked at Duncan, she would see his fear, and it would make hers worse. And she needed her fear to stay in the background, where she could use it as fuel, rather than letting it become the thing that froze her in place. She moved. The passage was narrow, dark, choked with dust. She climbed over debris, squeezed through gaps that scraped her shoulders raw, and followed the building's bones the way Leo had taught her. By feel, by logic, by the particular way the stone hummed when the load above was stable versus when it was compromised. The counterweight system was still active. She could feel the vibration of the aqueduct through the walls, a low thrumming that told her the primary structure was holding even where the secondary elements had failed. Left at the second junction, straight past the cistern access. Right at the place where the stone changed color from pale granite to the older, darker rock of the mountain's natural face. Leo had shown her this route on a Tuesday, tracing it on a hand-drawn map with the casual authority of a boy who knew his own castle the way other children knew their own bedrooms. She found him, curled in the triangular void he'd described, dusty and pale, but whole, his golden eyes enormous in the dark. "Miss Dunmore." His voice was solemn and slightly hoarse. "Your response time was 11 minutes. That's within acceptable parameters." She pulled him into her arms before she could think about it. He was stiff for a moment, an 8-year-old who had armored himself in data and logic the way she armored herself in preparation, and then he softened, his small hands gripping the back of her shirt. "I was not afraid," he said into her shoulder. "I know," she said. "I was, though." "Well," Patience said, returning as suddenly as she had vanished. Her voice was rough. "That was planned, obviously. You meant to do all of that. Very smooth. 10 out of 10. She had him. Now she had to get him out." The passage behind them had shifted. She could hear it. The low, grinding complaint of stone settling into a new configuration. The route she'd come through was narrowing, the secondary supports buckling under redistributed weight. She could fit. Leo could fit, but not quickly, and not safely. One wrong step on compromised stone and the whole passage would fold. "Miss Dunmore." Leo's voice was very calm. "The junction behind us has compressed approximately 14 centimeters since you arrived. The load trajectory suggests progressive failure within—" "I know," she said. "We need another way out." There wasn't one. She had cataloged this building for 6 weeks, and the service passages were single route. The only other exit was through the collapsed wing itself, through the rubble, through the beam that Serena's team couldn't shift from the outside.
She held Leo close, her back against the stone, and for the first time in a very long time, Freya Dunmore did not have a plan. Then the sound came, not from the passage, from the other side of the rubble wall. A deep, resonant growl, not a human sound, not anything close, followed by the groan of timber being forced out of position. Something enormous was moving stone and wood on the other side of the barrier with a methodical, relentless power that made the walls vibrate. A crack of light appeared, then wider. A massive oak beam, the one Serena's guards couldn't shift, scraped sideways with a shriek of stressed wood. Dust cascaded down. Leo pressed his face into her shoulder. The gap widened to 3 feet, and through it, backlit by torchlight, was a wolf. He was enormous, dark honey coat, heavy through the shoulders, and his eyes were pure gold. Not the flicker she'd seen in the corridors, not the managed glint behind the human irises, but the full, unfiltered thing. This was not Duncan Sterling, Alpha King, performing composure. This was the animal. And the animal had just torn through a ton of rubble with its bare body to reach them. The wolf looked at Leo first. A low, broken whine. Relief so raw it was almost a sob. Then his gaze moved to Freya, and she saw it. The wolf couldn't manage its face. The wolf didn't have a managed mode. What she saw looking back at her was completely, devastatingly unguarded. Not just the panic of a father, not just relief, but something underneath both. The wolf was looking at her the way Duncan looked at her in the corridors, and the library, and on the terrace, except without any of the walls, without the careful composure, without the measured words, without the 6 years of practiced restraint. Just the truth. The whole, unperformed truth of what this man felt about her. "Oh," Patience said, very quietly. "Well, that answers that." Freya carried Leo through the gap. Duncan, still in wolf form, still enormous, still radiating a heat she could feel through the dust-choked air, pressed close as they emerged, his massive body a barrier between them and the unstable ceiling. He stayed shifted until they were clear of the debris field, his flank against her side, Leo cradled between them. When he shifted back, it was abrupt and graceless, bones reforming, fur receding, the wolf giving way to a man on his knees in the dust. He was shaking. His hands, human again, reached for Leo first. He pulled his son against his chest, his face buried in the boy's dusty hair, and held on with the grip of a man who had just been given back the only thing in the world that mattered. Then he looked at Freya. His eyes, still gold-ringed, still wild. His voice, when it came, was his real voice. The one under the managed surface, the one he almost never used. "You got to him first." Not a question, a recognition. She nodded, and then the adrenaline hit, and she sat down on the floor very suddenly because her legs had decided, unilaterally, that they were finished. But the thing she'd seen in the wolf's eyes, the unguarded thing, the thing without walls, that didn't go away when she sat down. It stayed. She filed it, and she didn't know what to do with it yet. The aftermath was worse than the collapse. Alistair arrived within the hour. He surveyed the damage with the grim satisfaction of a man whose warnings had been vindicated, and his critique was devastating precisely because it was accurate. "A child nearly died in your own keep," he said, standing in the council chamber, his voice carrying the weight of a eulogy. "Not from an attack, not from an enemy, from a building that 3 generations of reports told you was failing. The Moss revenue could have funded the overhaul 5 times over. It was not funded because it was not prioritized. That is not bad luck, Duncan. That is governance." The council was silent. Duncan sat at the head of the table, Leo's dust still on his shirt, and said nothing, because Alistair was right. Freya was not in the council chamber. She was in her room, packing. She could see the trajectory. She had always been able to see it. the terrace, the library, the corridor with the phantom tail. 6 weeks of falling in love with a man who came to the schoolroom every afternoon and said things like, "You didn't flinch," and "It was the funniest thing I'd heard in 4 years." 6 weeks of watching his face soften when Leo laughed, of sitting close enough to touch and not touching, of reading every look and every silence for something that might not be there. Because Duncan Sterling had never, not once, said the thing she needed him to say. He had thanked her for what she did with Leo. He had smiled at her jokes. He had sat with her on a railing and told her he came to the schoolroom because she was funny. But funny wasn't love. Funny was a reason to keep a tutor, and Freya Dunmore was not going to stay in a castle full of sentient staircases and phantom tailwags, slowly dying of proximity to a man who might only see her as the best employee he'd ever hired. Her hands folded a blouse, placed it in the suitcase, folded another. "You're leaving," Patience said quietly. "Not because of the collapse. Because you think he doesn't love you." Freya said nothing. The silence was its own answer. "He sat with you on a railing looking at stars for 45 minutes. He quoted his own son in the dark because he knew it would make you laugh. He told you his worst fear, that he's failing Leo, and he has never told anyone that." A pause. "And his wolf looked at you through a gap in the rubble, and the wolf can't lie. You know what you saw. The man can manage his face. The wolf can't. What you saw in the wolf was not an employer looking at staff." Freya's hands stilled on the blouse. The tears came without permission.
"But sure," Patience said. "Let's pack."
Chapter 6. The Frequency. SFX. Council Chamber, morning light, chairs shifting. Duncan answered Alistair the next morning, not with words, not with exile, with action. He stood before the full council and did the hardest thing a king can do. He agreed with his critic. "Lord Graves is right," he said. His voice was his managed voice, but there was something underneath it now. Bedrock, not performance. The East Wing's structural failure was preventable. 3 generations of reports warned us. I did not act. That responsibility is mine. The council shifted. Alistair, for the first time in months, looked uncertain. "Effective immediately," Duncan continued, "I am ordering a full structural overhaul of the keep. The funds will come from the royal discretionary budget, not the Moss revenue. The kingdom's export infrastructure will not be compromised. I am appointing Serena as project lead, and I am inviting Lord Graves to serve as independent oversight." He looked at Alistair directly. "You've been telling me the building is failing. You're right. Help me fix it." It was not a defeat. It was not a concession. It was the specific, costly, difficult thing that a king does when he stops performing competence and starts demonstrating it. Alistair held his gaze for a long moment. Something passed between them. Not friendship exactly, not anymore, but the echo of it. The acknowledgement between 2 men who had both been right about different things and wrong about different things, and who were, perhaps, beginning to see where the lines fell. Then, slowly, Alistair inclined his head. "I accept," he said, and for the first time his voice held no edge. "Good," Riot said. Just that, warm and simple. "Good." That was true. The council session broke. Serena caught his arm in the corridor. "That was either the bravest or the stupidest thing you've ever done in that chamber," she said. Her eyes were bright. "Which do you think?" "Both, simultaneously. It's a talent." She paused. "The tutor is packing. I thought you should know." Duncan went very still. Riot went very still. The stillness was the same stillness. One entity, one response, one recognition that something was about to be lost unless he moved. He climbed the stairs to the guest quarters.
He found Freya's door open. Her suitcase was on the bed, half packed. She was standing by the window, looking out at the mountains, her face drawn and her eyes red-rimmed. She turned when he entered. "My contract is fulfilled," she said, her voice steady in the way of someone who has rehearsed this. "Leo is safe. He doesn't need a tutor anymore. He needs He needs you," Duncan said, not his managed voice, his real one, terse, low, stripped of everything except the truth. "He needs a tutor who won't. It doesn't matter. I can't stay." Why? The question was so simple it disarmed her. She had expected him to argue, to list reasons, to use the measured diplomatic voice he used on everyone. He didn't. He just asked. "Because I don't know what this is," she said, and the rehearsed steadiness cracked. "You've thanked me for Leo a dozen times. You come to the schoolroom every afternoon. You sat with me on a railing and told me I was funny, and none of that tells me if any of this is about me, or if I'm just the best thing that ever happened to your son." The words landed in the space between them. She watched his face. He was quiet for a long time. Not the managed quiet, the real quiet. The kind that meant he was choosing his words with the terrifying precision he normally reserved for one-line diplomatic strikes. "You taught Leo about the Peloponnesian War using his own plumbing schematics as a comparative model," he said. "You curse at the moving staircases under your breath in a way you think no one hears. You eat the jam tarts with the burnt edges because you think Leo doesn't notice you're leaving him the good ones. He does." A pause. "You sat on a stone railing at midnight and told me about being 12 and reading textbooks cover to cover for a class they wouldn't let you into. And it was the most specific, stubborn, beautiful thing I had ever heard about another person." She was staring at him. He wasn't finished. "I didn't fall in love with you because of Leo," he said. "Leo is why you're here. But you are why I come to the schoolroom every afternoon. You are why I quote my own son in dark libraries, because I know it will make you laugh, and your laugh is the best sound in this castle. You are why I sat on a freezing railing for 45 minutes and told you my worst fear, which I have never told anyone, because for some reason, when you're there, I stop performing and just say things." His voice dropped. "Those aren't Leo things, Freya. Those are you things." The room was very quiet. Outside, the mountains were turning blue in the late afternoon light. "You're making a speech," she said. Her voice was unsteady. "You don't make speeches." "I know. It's terrible. I'm going to stop." "Don't stop." He leaned against the doorframe. "I'm not going to ask you to stay. That's not mine to ask. But I need you to know, I come to the schoolroom every afternoon because of you. Because you're funny and you're stubborn, and you catalog everything, and you told me about being 12, and I haven't wanted to be near another person like this since Marin died. And that terrifies me, but it's real." She could see the gold flickering behind his eyes, not wild this time, not the feral blaze of the rescue. Steady, warm, the glow of something that had been burning quietly for weeks and was only now being allowed to show. She could see the wolf in his body, the absolute stillness, the slight forward lean, the way his fingers, resting against the doorframe, were trembling with the effort of not reaching for her. "You're shaking," she said. "Yes," he said, "it's a back spasm." A laugh escaped her, small, wet, startled, and real. "He made a joke," Patience said, with the tone of someone documenting a miracle. "The large, sad king made a joke. I want this noted for the record. This is a significant development." Duncan's mouth curved. Not a smile, something more private than that. She looked at him, at the tired, gentle, quietly devastating man who had just publicly agreed with his harshest critic, ordered the overhaul of his own castle, and then climbed 3 flights of stairs to tell her that the reason he came to the schoolroom every afternoon was because she was funny and stubborn, and told him things about being 12.
You could leave, Patience said. That's an option. You could go back to the city and teach 32 6-year-olds and never think about dodecahedrons or sentient staircases or sad kings with phantom tail wags again. A pause. Or. Freya Dunmore had always been able to see the trajectory, every angle of approach, every possible disaster, every way it could go wrong. She had catalogued them all, the way she catalogued everything, with exhaustive, obsessive thoroughness. She had not, until this moment, considered the possibility that the trajectory might include something going right. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay." Duncan crossed the distance. His hand found her cheek, not the phantom touch of the library, not the near miss of the corridor, but real, warm, steady contact. His thumb brushed away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. Something in him gave way. The managed surface, the careful wall, the 6 years of performing composure, all of it collapsed at once. And what was underneath was just a man who had been alone for a very long time, and was, suddenly, not. He pulled her close, his face buried in her hair, his arms tight around her, and the Alpha King of Silverwood Keep was trembling, like a man who had just been given back something he'd been afraid to want. "You're vibrating," Freya observed, her voice muffled against his chest. "Back spasm," he said, into her hair. "Of course." From the doorway, a polite cough. They turned. Leo stood there, holding his notebook, his golden eyes moving between them with the dispassionate focus of a scientist observing a successful experiment. He opened the notebook, made a final, precise checkmark, closed it. "Version 3.2 is complete," he said. "All criteria met. I'll file the final report." He walked away. "He planned this," Patience said, with undisguised admiration. "The entire thing, from the first day, the curriculum destruction, the list, the interruptions timed to build romantic tension through denial. He's 8 years old, and he ran a longitudinal parental happiness study with a sample size of 1. A long, sardonic pause. "I'm genuinely impressed. You should be taking notes." The 6 months that followed were the loudest the Great Library had ever been. It was rebuilt, not the cosmetic patch of previous generations, but the full structural overhaul Duncan had ordered. Alistair, true to his role as oversight, visited weekly. He was still difficult, still pointed, still convinced that several things about the kingdom could be improved. He was also, grudgingly, beginning to admit that the tutor had been a sound decision. Freya sat on the floor of the new East Wing, surrounded by books, explaining the socio-economic impact of the Peloponnesian War to a rapt Leo, who was simultaneously programming a small 6-legged robot to fetch jam tarts from the kitchen. Duncan was sprawled on a nearby sofa, ostensibly reading a treaty, but mostly watching them, with the focused attention of a man who had stopped performing contentment and was, for the first time in years, simply experiencing it. He hadn't looked tired in months. The shadows under his eyes were gone, replaced by something warmer, steadier, the face of a man who had finally stopped watching through glass. He caught her eye and smiled, the real smile, the one that lived under the managed surface and only came out when no one was performing. He got up, crossed the room, and settled on the floor beside her, his shoulder pressing against hers. The contact was casual, constant, and it still made something in her settle every time. "She's here," Riot said. He said it every time. Had been saying it for months now, every time she walked into the room, every time she sat beside them, every time the three of them were in the same place at the same time. Not a declaration, just a fact. The quiet, steady recognition of a wolf who had found the shape of his world and was content to live in it. "She's here." He pressed a soft kiss to her temple. Leo's robot scuttled past with a pilfered tart. Elspeth, the ancient librarian, opened one eye from her sunbeam, evaluated the scene, and went back to sleep. Patience sighed. Not sardonic, not reframing, just a sound of contentment so genuine it caught Freya off guard. Acceptable, Patience said. This is acceptable. From the floor, Leo produced a small, battered notebook. He had been working on a new list, which he left open where Freya could see it. The handwriting was neater now, the cursive more confident, and the title was new. Sibling Criteria, version 1.0, preliminary. Freya looked at the list, looked at Duncan, looked at the list again. Duncan looked at the list. His face went through several stages of emotional processing, landing somewhere between delight and existential terror. "Oh," Riot said, with the dawning wonder of a wolf who has just realized the den is about to get bigger. "Oh, we're going to need a bigger library," Patience observed. Leo, without looking up from his robot, made a small, satisfied tick mark. Then he closed the notebook, placed it precisely on the shelf beside his dodecahedron model, and went back to his jam tart.